a dangerous pick and mix approach to ideology, pulling together different things from different backgrounds. The past month of insecurity and isolation caused by the COVID crisis have exacerbated this tendency, paving the way for the rise and expansion of new forms of extremism and intolerant ideologies. The landscape of right-wing extremism is changing organizationally, and sports have been at the center of recent efforts of various right-wing networks. We are witnessing at the moment a rebranding and internationalization of these networks through a growing of far-right MMA events all over Europe, and the rise of associated fashion labels. Lead figures such as Nikitin, the founder of White Rex, are using a mix of business, martial arts, and networks to gain international visibility and professionalize their violence. In addition, we know that far-right networks are keen on recruiting members from the military and security services in order to build up their physical abilities and combat skills. Far-right extremists usually target refugees and asylum seekers, but also, more generally, the Muslim population, politicians, and sexual minorities. Many of these attacks are not being registered as terrorism, as police forces in various EU countries file them under extremist activities instead. As a result, Europol currently does not have a comprehensive database on all the far-right and terrorist incidents reported in the EU member states. Before the pandemic, EU police agencies, Europol has warned of growing far-right violence and urged more international cooperation to tackle this problem. A European approach is clearly needed. Thus, events like this are necessary to get a grasp of what is happening across Europe and discuss the possible solutions and best practices. Sports is an essential means of socialization in our societies. It can be a so powerful tool for fighting radicalization of every kind, as it builds and reinforces social ties, self-confidence, and a sense of purpose, which is often exactly what radicalized people lacked in the first place. It would be therefore of a big mistake to depict any sports group as the problem. Radicalization is the problem, and sports can be the solution, must be the solution. I personally find it a strong signal that representatives from all different political groups of the European Parliament, as well as speakers from the Commission, the Council of Europe, and scientists come together to have a talk about a favorable approach to bring a solution to this issue. So thank you very much for tuning in today. Thank you for our excellent speakers and for all the colleagues that have made this happen. I now give the word to my colleague, Iban Garcia de Blanco.
Thank you very much, Niklas, and thank you to Viola as well for organizing this timely conference. And I hope, first of all, that all of you are safe and your relatives and family so in this pandemic that is so hard so tough to stand for all of us. So for most of us, the question of sports is exactly the opposite of violence. For most of us, sports builds community, cohesion, grows social inclusion, and leads to an enhanced sense of European identity. Therefore, sport represents an integral part of our lives because it is a vital part of what it means to be European. That's why us as policymakers, education professionals, and experts are involved in this event and in ensuring that the sport continues to tackle challenges like the one we are discussing today. But providing all of this, the fact is that far-right groups across Europe are using combat sports and recruiting tool to swell their numbers and spread an ideology that is jeopardizing our democracy. And I absolutely agree with Niklas. The problem is not the sport. The problem is the uses of sports and the uses against even the nature of sports itself. So I hope and I look forward this panel will be absolutely fruitful. I'm sure of this. Unfortunately, that is the reason I'm talking in this moment. I have to leave because I have a last minute event and I have to leave. I'm so sad about this question because I'm so interested in this panel. But I look forward you'll have a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much, and I think my group as well. I'm open to discuss about this question, and I think that we have even to strive for the solution because for this topic will be a key point even in the politics developed by the Commission. That is not the case in this moment, unfortunately. I think so. Thank you very much and have a good panel. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Ivan and Niklas, for your important words, your warm welcoming, and your interest that we together maybe can start some initiatives. And before I hand over the word to Robert Klaus, who will be the first speaker today, I would like to introduce quickly the entire panelists, because we are very glad that we have an excellent panel, first panel and a second panel today, and we have the opportunity to listen to 6 distinguished speakers, guests from different European countries with different backgrounds, but all very dedicated to this topic. So first of all, there's Robert Klaus. He is based in Germany, in Berlin. He's a journalist and an author, but also working in an NGO, mainly on right-wing extremism and sports in a broader sense. It's called in German Competence Group for Fan Cultures and Sports-Related Social Work, which is a little bit complicated, but it is a very unique institution. It's very important, and it really brings people together who work on the same issue. And before Robert does it himself, I would recommend to all German speakers at least read his new book. It is really worth, and it gives a fantastic overview over the topic which we're gonna cover today. But he's also involved into concrete projects such as advising Borussia Dortmund in its commitment against right-wing extremism and discrimination. So it's not just the academic background and his experience in journalism, but it is also especially practical experience on the ground. As a second speaker today, there will be Julia Handel. She is, and I'm very glad that we could ask her to participate today. She's a research fellow and a project coordinator at the Violence Prevention Network in Berlin, but she also cooperates with the European Commission, and she will go further into detail with this. But she focuses mainly on de-radicalization, and she works on prevention projects, network on this, and also tries to find out how to develop a network due to the capacities we have here in the European Union. So hopefully after our event today, we can together with the European Commission work on this broader network with the member states. The third person, I'm very glad that he agreed to speak today, is Stanislav Frossard. Stanislav is the executive secretary of the so-called Enlarged Partial Agreement on Sport, which is an intergovernmental body or platform of cooperation of the Council of Europe on sports policy. And whoever deals with sports in Europe will come across with this institution, while the Council of Europe has a lot of not issues, but duties and tasks, especially on prevention of anti-doping code. And there's also the I think the betting, isn't that? But you're gonna explain a little bit what is EPAR, and then maybe more in detail why you are working on this special issue and what you have already achieved, and why it is mainly a question of implementing, let's say, the drafts or the resolution you have already worked on. I think this is very important to say, that the Council of Europe is actually the crucial institution, the crucial instrument for us to work as. While countries such as Russia, Ukraine, Turkey are also members of the Council of Europe, this is an important body. And I think many people underestimate the reach out of this institution. The next speaker, we are very glad to have him on board, is Michael Colborne. Michael Colborne has also a long track record of experience, especially in that particular field. He is a journalist who has written extensively about the radical right. His current focus more on the right wing in Central and Eastern Europe, with a special interest in transnational radical right extremism. And since I'm heavily involved in the Western Balkan and also in the Eastern Partnership countries such as Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, and others, and especially in Serbia, I know why it is important to work on this transnational radical extremism. And I'm looking very much forward on Michael's experience and also his analysis. He worked also on the Bellingcat monitoring project. Bellingcat is an investigative journalism project, which is a very delicate, let's say, project. And you might also explain a little bit about the Bellingcat structures and how you work on this particular issue. And also, I think you have a lot of experience on Ukraine, while we have also a speaker from Ukraine, but I think your experience is more on a meta level as well. And then we have a speaker from Poland, Przemysław Witkowski. Thanks for joining our great panel today. Przemysław is a journalist and also an author, researcher, and a lecturer. Currently, he teaches at the Collegium Civitas at the Institute of Journalism and Social Communication in Warsaw. But he has also a lot of experience in different NGOs. He worked with different ethnic minorities, and his interest is, of course, finding out culture sensitive, cooperating with those minorities. And of course, when you look through Poland and when you look through the cultures of the right-wing extremism and the combat fight structures, you see on one hand a big issue on the homophobe, let's say, networks, which is hardly, or which is very close linked to the, let's say, ethnic minorities. So thanks a lot for giving us later some more insight on these issues. Pavel Klimenko is from Ukraine. He is an Eastern European Development Officer at the FAR network, and it might be interesting to hear a little bit more about this FAR project in general. He's from Kiev Municipal University, but not only, he has also masters in global studies from the universities of Vienna and Leipzig. And he's an expert on xenophobia and the far right in football, with focus on Eastern Europe. So you can imagine we have tried to cover all the different, let's say, issues and problems which are interlinked with right-wing extremism and combat sports in the European Union. And I would like to hand over now to our first speaker, who will introduce into today's topic, who is Robert Klaus. And Robert, if you like, you can start with your presentation. I hope that works.
Thanks for the kind introduction and your kind words. I'm going to share my screen right now. Just one more second and it's going to work, I hope. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm very happy that we are going to have this meeting today because I think it's a very important topic, which we don't talk enough about in Germany, which we do not talk enough about in the European Union. I think it's a very important meeting. I'm having the difficult task to give a brief and short overview over the development of combat sports in the far right in Europe, which is not that easy because, of course, every European country has a different political discourse with different national organizations and different national traditions, cultures, and also regulations on combat sports. Just an example, mixed martial arts events, for example, have basically been forbidden in France for the past years. On the other hand, in Poland, there are events which take place in front of 20,000 people in big stadia. So the culture of combat sports are very different all over Europe. Which all European countries have in common, on the other hand, are the debates on migration over the past years. Of course, everybody noticed them. Everybody knows that the numbers of refugees have been growing in the years 2015 and 2016. Which is one of the sources for the reason that far-right politics have grown. And in Germany, you can definitely say that the debates on migration and refugees and asylum in Germany have been one of the major debates where far-right politics tried to heavily influence the discourse and created the slogan of defending Europe, which is, I think, one of the slogans which is used all over Europe. They, of course, understand a racially white Europe by that. And I don't think there is a purpose behind it that the boom of the far-right combat sport market is took place in about the same time, which means over the past 5 years. And I'm going to give a short introduction to that in the next minutes. One remark in advance might be allowed. Far-right ideology is fundamentally violent. The speakers before already said that. You can look at the historic Hitlerjugend. They trained boxing like 100 years ago or almost 100 years ago. So it's not really new that neo-Nazis are trying to fight or training combat in some way. I think what's new is that far-right organizations are trying to adapt to a neoliberal market of combat sports and are pushing its values. If you look at the Kampf der Nibelungen, which I'm going to explain a little more right in the next minutes, one of its slogans is dedication, discipline, and effort. So they're not really claiming a white race to fight. They're also doing that, but their main slogan is dedication, discipline, and effort. So they're trying to adapt to the general growth of the fitness market. I think that's a very important aspect over the whole development in general. The Kampf der Nibelungen is a German Nazi fascist combat sports event, which was founded in 2013. It first took place as a secret event called Ring der Nibelungen the first 2 years. And it grew very fast over the past years because in 2018, it almost attracted 1,000 people to their audience, international as nationals as well. So the fighters as well as the audience came from all over Europe. Even some people from the USA attended the event. So you have to keep in mind, if 1,000 militant neo-Nazis come to that event, that's a very dangerous happening at that evening. And there is a big network behind, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more. If you look at the left side, I think it's important to pronounce that it's not only mixed martial arts which is offered there, it's also boxing and K1, so a kind of kickboxing. So we are talking about a broad range of combat sports here. And there is a colored list of sponsors below the on the lower side of the poster, which I'm going to talk about later. If you look at the poster, it's not really telling you in the first place that this is a fascist combat sports event. It's rather playing with the aesthetic of combat sports events in general, but there are a lot of sources which are telling us about the political aspects of this event. First of all, there is the homepage of the Kampf der Nibelungen. Kampf actually means battle, so Battle of the Nibelungen we should say, which is saying at their homepage the Battle of Nibelungen does not want to understand sports as part of a rotten system. They understand the liberal democracy as this rotten system. There is another source, the magazine NS Today, so it's National Socialism Today from Dortmund, which says, at the Kampf der Nibelungen, proud Europeans are competing. They still know their roots and stand for a wide Europe of fatherlands instead of letting it degenerate to a multicultural shithole. Sorry for that language. It's a quote. It's a quotation here, and you're getting already the idea how important their identity of a white supremacist Europe against migration is. And it's not only Europe. It's also the US. There are links to the Rise Above movement in the USA, where some people are also training combat sports. And there is a quotation from this summer where one of the main people says, in the nationalist movement, the ideals of strength, masculinity, discipline, even the warrior spirit all seem to be some of the most valued virtues to possess. So it's all about political violence. It's about the identity of a white supremacist Europe. Okay, let me go. If you have a closer look on the list of people who attended the event, of course, there is a big list of 1,000 people. I'm just going to present you very briefly 3 of them. On the left upper side, you have Robin Schmiemann. The German authorities say that he was part of the Combat 18 network, so a terrorist network. On the right side, you have Sven Schröder, who was convicted of manslaughtering a punk in Dortmund in 2005, I think. And on the lower side, you have Thomas Skatulski, who is probably affiliated to the International Blood and Honor Network. You see the tattoo on his right arm. So it's the SS tattoo. So there is no question about the character of the audience to this combat sports event. We are talking about very close links to the international far-right terrorism. The Kampf der Nibelungen also had some more actions, which I'm not going into very deep. They had seminars on self-defense, which is actually only street fight and street combat. They had congresses on, well, let's say public health and national socialism. They had more combat sports event coming in their shadow, like the TVATS, which is a smaller event from the far right in Saxony in Eastern Germany. And the Kampf der Nibelungen is still planning to do a stream, so an online event for October 10th, which is, I think, in 11 days. They had a raid from the police last week, and it's not really clear if the event will take place. But, well, it's going to be interesting to see if it can take place. But right now you can see they are very active. If you have a closer look into the network of the Kampf der Nibelungen on a national level, and again, I'm not going to tell you about all of these groups. I just want to show you the network over the national scale. Then you have a broad range of fascist Kameradschaften, we say in Deutsch, camaraderie, of fascist groups like Knockout 51, 51, Baltic Corps. So there are different fascist training groups all over Germany. Secondly, you have a list of labels, trademarks, which are producing far-right combat sports clothings. Some of them are linked to far-right music, which is important because I think music and combat sports together create somehow an event culture of far-right recruitment. Those are 5 of the labels. If you have any questions later on, you please ask me, but I don't think I have the time to tell you about every one of those. Then you have 2 far-right combat sports events in Germany, and you have about 3 parties which are either linked to combat sports in Germany or doing combat sports itself. I'm not even saying that this list is complete, but I just wanted to give you, well, a short idea of how broad this range of labels, fascist groups, far-right events and parties is in Germany, because if you put them on the map, then it kind of looks like this. You have a big center in the east, well, lower east of Germany, but also some influence from neo-Nazis from Western Germany. And if you put those groups there, then you see that they almost cover all the map of the whole of Germany. There are 2 symbols which I didn't explain yet. The one is the 2 hammers crossed below there, it's the logo of the Hammerskins, which is one of the, I think, 2 important terrorist far-right networks which we have in Germany, in Europe. And the other one is the logo of Resistant on the lower right, which I think is definitely part of the German network, but it's linked to Hungary. I will talk about that a little later, but it's a first hint to the fact that we don't only have to look at the German network, we have to keep in mind that it's a European network which is working closely together. Which, well, now I'm coming to the European level. Very important for the European level is Dennis Kapustin, who worked as Dennis Nikitin for years in Europe and who founded the trademark White Rex in 2008. He has a German and Russian background as a hooligan because his family comes from Moscow but moved to Germany, to Cologne, I think in 2001. He founded White Rex in 2008 and kind of was the role model for the development of far-right combat sports all over Europe. And there is a quote from him at the Ukrainian hooligan forum troublemakers.com where he said, "My task is global. I have to cover all aspects of a modern life. White Rex is an alternative attitude, which I want to create 100%. And now he says something about the strategy, because he said he wants to create this with clothing, tournaments, nutrition, and fitness gyms. And that's exactly what the scene does. There are some labels which are only producing sports equipment, but there also is the label of Jotunheim Nutrition from Sweden, which is producing and distributing nutrition for far-right combat sport athletes. Most of these labels have a joint homepage called Too White for You. Of course, it's another racist slogan where they sell their clothing all over Europe. And it's also, this list is also the network of sponsors which are sponsoring far-right combat sports events all over Europe. On the right side, you see the Pro Patria event from Greece. And again, we have 2 big terrorist networks, far-right terrorist networks in Europe, Blood and Honor and the Hammerskins. Blood and Honor is forbidden in Germany, the Hammerskins are not. But Blood and Honor does have national divisions all over Europe. One of their most active ones is in Hungary. Secondly, you have labels of far-right clothing brands all over Europe too. There's White Rex on the left side, then it's PPDM Straight Edge. We have Pride France from France. We have Swaston from the Ukraine. We are going to talk about this a little more, I think. We have far-right combat sports events all over Europe. There is First to Fight in Poland. There are the Silesian Wars linked to Octagon in the Czech Republic. There was Tana della Tigre in Italy and the Pro Patria Fest in Greece. So again, we have an international network which is organized all across over Europe. And we have another more fascist organizations like the NS Fight Club in Sofia, Hogar Social in Madrid, which is training combat sports as well, Krisi Avdi in Greece, and the Nordic resistance movement in Scandinavia. They all are linked to combat sports, and I put them on the map just to show you how far the network reaches there. I think I already mentioned it. This list, or the map you're seeing right now, is not complete. We are having a lot of experts here which can, I really beg you to add to this list. I didn't put more labels on it because I think it would be, well, not easy to understand and to see. But I'm going to click one more because one very important organization is missing right now, and that's the Azov Regiment in the Ukraine, which is very big on the right side right now. The Azov Regiment, I think Michael and Pavel can talk a little more about that in the next hour. But let's say if you go through the social media of fascist German accounts, then you see one example, which you see only the name MZ, it's longer, of course, who's following all important far-right combat sports accounts in Germany and also posting friendship posts to the Ukrainian military. So I don't know if this person has been there, but all the posts are indicating that he has. And German authorities are talking about the numbers that about 1,000 international fighters have gone to the Ukraine to serve for Azov Regiment, and about 150 Germans are amongst them. I'm almost done, Viola. And I already said, that combat sports, militia, and far-right music are linked very closely to each other, and the Ukraine is, especially Kiev, developed to somehow the El Dorado for the international militant neo-Nazi scene over the past years. For example, there has been the Asgardskrai Festival in December 2019 with international far-right bands, and they had the MMA event Winter Raid in the evening before that. So they are linking those two things very close to each other. If you don't know what the Azov regiment is, there is a picture on the left side. You see those skulls. So they're symbolic. Their ideology is very far right. It's National Socialist, and I think especially the Ukraine is the hotspot to understand how far right music, far right combat sports, and far right paramilitary training are working together, since the activities are very high there. People also went to Greece, so I'm just going to jump that, but in their racist ideology, they also, this network also mobilized to Greece to fight migrants. I'm coming to my conclusions. If you have a look at the network I just presented to you, then it's easy to see that neo-Nazis finance their political activities and hidden comrades by events and labels which they are promoting. They are also using it for recruiting young people. They offer an event culture of violent masculinity, aggressive action, and political hatred to mobilize new members, and it's mostly connected to far-right music. Third, their networks reach from local far-right groups, as I have shown you, to international terrorist networks. Four, of course, they use combat sports not just as a sport or to feel better for themselves. They use it to professionalize their fighting techniques, and the capabilities of ideologically trained combat sports and war experienced fascists are very dangerous. I think it's a very big task for the German authorities and the international authorities to, well, to keep an eye on these people who fought in the Ukraine and who are war experienced. And of course, their political strategy is, they're trying to influence the political discourse and the landscape of combat sports in Europe in purpose to escalate conflicts on migration, because their main ideal is a racially white Europe. So there are a lot of functions which combat sports has in the far right, but I think the biggest question we have to talk about, besides, well, of course, we can go into every national context a little deeper, but the biggest question is which national and European policies in terms of prevention and intervention in combat sports do we actually need? I think that's something very important, which we have to talk about, which we already do in Germany. Viola, you already showed the cover of my newest book, which is on the left side, but I also work in a project which is called Vollkontakt. So in English, it's Full Contact, Democracy and Combat Sports, together with my beloved colleagues Olaf Zayonk and Michael Stark, where we are doing research in German gyms on the question how prevention in combat sports can look like. And my book is only in German, but our project homepage is also in English. So you might just take a look there.
Okay.
Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot for your great presentation and your really impressive introduction. I'm not so sure whether you can remove the last page of your presentation. I would ask you, maybe for people who would be interested in receiving it, that we can then, when we provide the recording of this event, of this online event, also put together the set of presentation which have been shown then, and maybe people are interested to have a look later on. Before I give the floor and the word to Julia now, I would also ask everyone who would like to be more interactive, not just listening, raising the question, use the Q&A formula or format and type in your questions. Unfortunately, we cannot do that orally, but you can raise all the questions, all the critical comments, remarks whatsoever. And when Julia and Stanislav have spoken, I will read them out. And even if you have comments right now, I'm happy to share them with our panelists. And then, of course, we will have a Q&A. And the second panel then will start with Michael exactly at 1 o'clock. So Julia, it's your floor, it's your turn, and whatever you would like to say. I think the crucial question was already put up on the last file of Robert, which says what can we do in prevention and what can we do to really combat this right-wing extremism in sports. Julia, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you all see my screen? I think you can.
Yes.
Perfect. Yes, well, thank you for inviting me to speak at this event. I'm very happy as well that this topic is being pushed on a European level. And as I'm speaking on behalf of the Radicalization Awareness Network, I would like to quickly say a few words on Iran for those of you who don't know us yet. So what is Iran? The Radicalization Awareness Network is a network of practitioners throughout Europe. It was founded in 2012, and is funded by the European Commission. And right now there's more than 6,000 practitioners who are involved in the network. More than 350 meetings have been organized. And the RAN basically has 3 main objectives. The first is to facilitate the exchange among practitioners in Europe, but also among practitioners and policymakers and stakeholders, etc. Second is to support the EU and its member states by drafting policy papers and issue papers that then inform and feed into policy debates. And third is to collect and disseminate everything that RAN has learned throughout all the RAN activities. And one example is the RAN collection of approaches and practices, which contains, I think, more than 200 interesting and inspiring practices from all over Europe, and that you can find on our website, and that is also constantly being updated. So if you are interested in that, check out our website or feel free to ask me any questions. And yes, the RAN has also picked up combat sports and right-wing extremism as a new topic, sort of new topic. And yes, when we need to talk about this, I think one thing that Robert has made very clear in his presentation is that society is always changing. There's always new trends, and we've seen this sort of fitness boom, this interest in health, in body cult, beauty, nutrition, gyms, etc. Of course, also accelerated through Instagram and social media. And extremist organizations, no matter what ideology, have always been very good at exploiting and capitalizing these trends. And this is also the case with combat sports and mixed martial arts, which have become very popular in this new trend. So we know that radicalization and recruitment is taking place in sportive context, and this is not exclusive to mixed martial arts or combat sports. This could also be in football clubs, but we know that combat sports have become very popular, especially because of the notion, as Robert has mentioned, the notion of fighting and strength and masculinity and preparing to, overthrow the government, democracy, or fight on the ground somewhere, be it in Ukraine or Syria and Iraq. Because we've not only seen that in right-wing extremism, but also in Islamist extremism in the past. There's been a number of very prominent MMA fighters who have fought for Daesh in Syria and Iraq, and who have trained in MMA studios in Europe before, or Thailand before going there. But more recently, with the international MMA events, what Robert just has pointed out, we really see the threat in right-wing extremism, because these events, they operate on the verge of what's legal and what's illegal, and they really encourage an international network, and as Robert has clearly pointed out, also the professionalization of the field. And on the other hand, and this is also why we need to be talking about this, and this is also something that has been touched upon in the introduction, is that sports can offer so many positive effects, such as improving self-confidence, contributing to identity building, learning to lose, learning to win, learning to respect your opponent, etc. And these are all steps that are very important in prevention work. And also, we have many positive experiences from other fields that are somewhat related to preventing of extremism, which is crime reduction, the rehabilitation and reintegration of offenders, and also post-war contexts and peace-building measures. So we know that there's an immense potential in sports and also in combat sports that should be used. But right now, it's not really standardized yet to include sports in preventing or countering violent extremism programs. But generally speaking, you can distinguish 3 broad types of programs that use sports in their preventing violent extremism programs. So you have sort of primary prevention programs, which are often initiated by sport clubs. I've picked here 2 examples from football, from the Premier League and from FIFA. They sort of introduced counter-narrative campaigns that are aimed at a very broad audience. And then we, of course, also already have products and programs in Europe that are very sports-focused and that are very specific and that aim at vulnerable youth who are at risk of radicalization. And I've picked 2 programs here that actually use combat sports. So the KO Racism courses from the UK, which is a boxing program that also includes education on multicultural society and on critical thinking, etc. And then also the Not in God's Name Vienna program, from Vienna, Austria, which is actually an MMA-based project that also includes MMA training as well as educational sessions on critical thinking. And I'd also be interested to know if by any chance people from these programs are participating today. If yes, I'd be happy to hear from you also in the chat. Also, because this is an opportunity for you to express what you actually need from policymakers to support your work. And then we have more general intervention programs that are not specifically aimed at sports and that usually work with individuals that are already radicalized or who have been sentenced for extremist or terrorist offenses. And they use all sorts of counseling techniques and sometimes include sports wherever they feel it's necessary or where it's beneficial for the individual. So we see that there's already a lot of work being done in prevention work, including sports. And when we look at combat sports and mixed martial arts, there are still a lot of challenges. And I think one thing that Robert's presentation has made very clear is that when we look at extremist, let's say MMA clubs, this is not really the place for prevention work anymore, because it's a very closed circle. It's almost impossible for prevention actors to get in. And frankly speaking, it's too late. So this would be the place for exit work, for intervention work. But this doesn't mean that we shouldn't include regular MMA clubs that are not extremist in prevention work, because it still has good potential and it can have positive effects, and there might be vulnerable youth training there. So we should keep that in mind, as Robert has also said, not to stigmatize the whole sport. But still there are challenges. And one of the main challenges is that there are very little regulations in combat sports, or especially MMA. There are federations, but as Robert has also said, in some countries it's not yet acknowledged as a sport, in some countries it is. And there's not really a governing body like FIFA, for example, for football, that can send some clear messages or some ground rules that prevention actors can actually stick to, reach out to, or also just get some backup from an international institution. And I mean, it's clear that radicalization and right-wing extremism is a societal problem, and we need to fight it as a society, and we cannot leave single MMA clubs on their own in their fight against extremism. But at the same time, the sport does have responsibility, because frankly, it's quite hard for prevention actors to work as long as there are still extremist fighters that participate in fights on national or international levels, because it's also hard to legitimize the work if that still takes place. Also, there's a variety of actors active in mixed martial arts. We know from experiences that some of the MMA studio operators have links to other fields or businesses, such as private security companies or also motorcycle gangs, which makes it quite hard to get access to clubs, because they have very strong networks and links to each other, and they don't want to tell on each other. And they also have a big fear of stigmatization, which is Yeah, which is a problem in prevention work per se. It's always a question of framing and wording, and of course, if a studio is approached to participate in a prevention program, they are scared to admit to, or they feel like they're admitting to having a problem. But nevertheless, although there are quite a few challenges, we do have some recommendations based on the practical experiences from our network members, how to include sports in a program. And one of the most important recommendations would be to create a program that is as holistic as possible. So don't only focus on the sport, but also on creating a space for dialogue, creating a space for critical thinking, for unpacking gender stereotypes, for example. And this can be done through strong partnerships and cooperations with sport clubs, because prevention programs need skilled and trained staff, such as social workers or pedagogues or psychologists, etc., because these skills might not necessarily lie in sports clubs, obviously, but through these cooperations, you can ensure that you have the sportive quality and the fun experience for the participants, but at the same time, you also have the pedagogical quality, and this is very important. And then what's also important is that prevention actors make their offers known to sport clubs, because if a sport club wants to get engaged in prevention work, they need to know who to reach out to. Or also when they suspect a case of radicalization, they need to know who to turn to. So it's important to kind of spread the word that people know what's out there. And then lastly, and this is my last point, I'm going to finish with that, is evaluation. Right now, there's very little evidence on what actually works regarding sport and PCV or preventing and countering violent extremism. So we really need to push on evaluation or evaluating these programs that are out there to also not only know what works, but also to set some quality standards at best on an international level. And these are all, I'm hoping to discuss these points with you today. I'd be done here. If there's any practitioners here that work in such programs, I'd be more than happy to hear from you in the chat. I don't know if you can turn on the cameras, but yeah, feel free to shoot any questions.
Thanks a lot, Julia. That was very comprehensive and good overview over possible and potential prevention programs. There are already a couple of questions, but I would rather quickly give the floor to Stanislav Frossard from EPAS, from the Council of Europe first, and then I will read out the questions, and then we start the second panel with Michael Colborn, Przemysław Witkowski, and Pavel Klimenko from Ukraine. So please, Stanislav, would you like to take over for the third?
Yes, thank you very much, Viola, and it's my pleasure to be here with you today. And I would like to start from the question that was raised by Robert. What kind of policies do we need at a national and international level to cover combat sport and combat activities? Because we are not, we have already started a reflection on this with our intergovernmental network. EPAS is a group of 39 countries which are interested in cooperation on sports policies within the Council of Europe. So it's covering the entire European continent from Azerbaijan to Iceland, and not just the EU member states. And we have worked on combat sport and martial arts since 2017. And the background for this was that there was a recommendation, an intergovernmental recommendation to member states on the prohibition of free fight and cage fighting, which had been adopted in '99. And it was obvious that it was not observed and not implemented by most member states, and that there was still a number of issues in this area of combat activities, martial arts. I'm on purpose not mentioning combat sport because we have huge debate at international level. A number of countries consider that not all of them should be recognized as sport, and therefore we are a little bit reluctant to mention combat sport. But I fully understand that you refer to combat sport. And those issues that were addressed are the following. It's the definition, the designation, the regulation of those activities, the protection of minors, for instance. Are there some activities which present dangers and that should not be offered to minors? The training and the certification of trainers in these activities, health issues and safety of the practitioners issues, the media coverage of those activities, which have a huge visibility and commercial success, the economic factors, because it's also driven by an high demand, and some of these organizations are very business oriented and gain a lot of influence and power through these commercial activities. Some issues of public order, and this is what you are addressing today. Due to the underground form of participation, the fact that some of these areas are developed in a gray area, and possible link with criminal illegal activities, including radicalization and right extremism. And lastly, we also addressed the impact of the development of these activities on the traditional sports activities. And indeed, it's very difficult to look at combat sport, combat activities, because the landscape is very fragmented. There are maybe 15 international federations recognized by GAIS, which is the umbrella organization of international federation. But then there are a number of federations which claim recognition and maybe are not yet recognized for good reasons. And a number who don't care about recognition as sport, or who on purpose operate in underground as an underground activity. And of course, due to this gray area fragmentation, many of these activities are operating under the radar of the public policies and under the radar of the sports movement, mainstream sports movement, coordinated under the Olympic movement. And it was a bit difficult to address these issues with our partners, but there is an interest from the International Federation to enhance their preventative measures and to enhance coordination. There is even interest from the MMA mainstream organizations to engage in discussion and to enhance their coordination. And most governments are interested in this. So we have drafted a recommendation of the Committee of Ministers to member states, which will be processed soon to the Committee of Ministers, which request member states of the Council of Europe to clarify the responsibilities from the different stakeholders at national level. What is the role of the ministry responsible for sport, Ministry of Interior, sports movement, and so on. And then within this framework, to design a policy and effective measures to support prevention of health and safety issues. And similarly, the prevention of risk on safety and the fight against potential criminal activity and radicalization within combat activities and martial art. So now, at this stage, we will see what the reaction will be, but we will keep this on the agenda. And I'm very happy today to meet many experts, researchers, academia, which worked in this area. While preparing the recommendation, we have been in contact with a number of researchers from the Netherlands and France, but sometimes they were a little bit isolated. And as it's often the case when we have an emerging issue in sports policy, we have a number of countries which say, it looks worrying, it looks interesting, but we consider that it does not exist in my country. And the more countries have NGOs, researchers, which are paying attention to this, the better it will be possible to document and to move forward on this. So thank you for this webinar, and I look forward to answering questions that may come in the discussion. Thank you.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Stanislav. Now we are running a little bit out of time, and we have just mentioned in the chat that the first question, which was given to Robert Klaus, it also refers to partly the subject of Michael Colburn later, so he's going to refer to this. That's a question from Volker Helmut. thanks to he has limited his insights on separated networks of right-wing activists. I would be interested to learn more about the problem of right-wing extremists that are joining ordinary sports clubs with the objective to control and use them for their objectives. This is not limited to a combat sport. What does Robert Klaus know about this strategy, and what should and can be done by the sports clubs to avoid such an infiltration? And to Julia, maybe already the next question. International MMA Federation, based in Sweden, is developing the amateur side of MMA and being very successful on the regulations. So I also thought we have a lack of regulation, and we're going to talk about this in the European Parliament later, but maybe this is just for you to know. And from Oliver Kamp, there's another question. Should we proactively embrace MMA clubs to the national sports federations? It's a little bit similar to what Volker Helmut had asked, to be able to reach out to the non-right-wing organizations. And another one from Oliver, it says, should we aim to use UEFA Euro 2024 as a vehicle to address the problem? Maybe this could be also covered then later by Pavel and by Przemysław as well. I think this is an overall question, how we're going to use this international sports event. And there's somebody, Joachim Tumfahrt, asking, representing Jiu-Jitsu International Federation here. So we are a recognized sports federation, and I'm always interested to get us involved in social and pedagogic aspects of combat sports. This is maybe to Julia. And there are three questions which are a little bit longer. I will leave it for now until this point. And then I will ask Robert quickly to answer Julia, and then I will hand over to Michael first, and we will continue with the questions a bit later. Robert.
Which question am I going to answer? Sorry,
the question of Volker Helmut. I mean, that's not just a question of combat sport. He said in general, that's undermining of national sports structures. What can we do to fight this?
It's actually a very big question. I'm trying to keep it short. First of all, I would say I don't think there is a real strategy to instrumentalize sports clubs. It's rather that most of those people are part of their local communities and doing sports as part of a local culture. So the real strategy to undermine sport clubs, I don't think it's there. Nonetheless, the problem still exists because most of the fighters who have fought at the Kampf der Nibelungen, they do not train at originally far-right gyms. They normally train at gyms which are either not aware of the fact that they have fascist fighters there, or they are tolerating them. So the basic answer, I think, is I think we need regulation in Germany politically. Seriously, I do think that, because right now every violent fascist can open a combat sport gym in Germany, which I don't think is right. Secondly, all those democratic gyms, and that's the vast majority, of course, has the task to inform itself about far-right labels, far-right tattoos, to see those things if they're there, and then finally expel fascists from their gym. Is that okay?
Yeah,
if
that's
there's any more question, or if we shall talk about that longer, we can email. That's okay.
That's perfect. And also about this regulation thing, I guess we have to pick it up in the parliament in a bigger format anyway. Julia, is there anything from your side maybe to go?
Yes, maybe. I'm just waving back hello at Joachim. Feel free to always reach out to the RAN. There's going to be a publication soon on this topic, and maybe there's also going to be events in the future. Just check the website and feel free to reach out. And then maybe the question, to touch up on the three last questions. They're very long, but I'm just going to quickly touch upon them about the border between combat sports as an educational tool and also the risk of radicalization. This is especially what I meant when I said we need to create holistic prevention programs to not only focus on the sport, because the sport remains a very masculine sport. First of all, it's still focused on strength and fighting, and prevention programs are always aimed at creating an open space for dialogue, for being vulnerable, for showing emotions. And that is very important when combat sports are included in prevention programs. And also we need to think about our target group who we're reaching out to, because as we've seen in the sport, there are women fighting, but mostly men, but there might be women in the audience radicalizing, basically passively by watching it. How do we reach out to those target groups? So these are all aspects to consider when creating a prevention program. And then also maybe it needs to be top down and bottom up at the same time. We cannot leave regular studios who are not extremists but who maybe observe cases of radicalization on their own. We need to support them, but we also need regulation from top. As Robert says, it's just simply impossible for prevention to work when there's extremist fighting clubs opening up in Germany or wherever in Europe.
Perfect. Thanks, Julia, for the very brief and precise answer. I will hand over to Michael and will also read out to everyone the first question, which was actually given to Robert, but I think Michael can go to respond this. Professional MMA in UK and US is much bigger than in continental Europe, but it seems the far-right connection is not that strong there. Anything to learn from their kind of organization of the sport? Michael, the floor is yours.
Thanks for the question. It's one thing, I'm originally from Canada, and something that really struck me when I started working more over in Europe several years ago, and particularly in Central Eastern Europe, and touched on the far right and MMA, I was particularly struck by how differently mixed martial arts worked in Central and Eastern Europe versus what I was used to seeing back home in Canada, an environment quite similar to the United States, where mixed martial arts is much bigger, it's much more mainstream in Canada, the US, and the UK as well, and I guess quote unquote Anglo-American countries. It's the mainstream UFC events get coverage on mainstream sports shows. There's MMA gyms in towns and cities and suburbs. But the idea in the United States now, I think there are more opportunities or efforts being made by some on the far right to kind of do their own mixed martial arts thing on the far right. The Rise Above movement, RAM being the kind of the pinnacle of that, but it's not something that, despite their best efforts, has caught on yet. And I can't speak directly to the UK right now, but I imagine it's a bit of a similar environment to that. But also when I look at my own country, Canada, the idea of a far right movement or people on the far right trying to co-opt mainstream MMA, if they want to try to do that, it's a much more uphill battle. I think if there's any lessons for Europe from the Canadian, American, and British experiences, it's probably some of what was being alluded to earlier, especially by Julia, by practitioners, and working with official mixed martial arts organizations or authorities in different countries. I think it's important to separate the world of perfectly legitimate mainstream mixed martial arts as a sport, as a pastime, as to have mixed martial arts gyms around, that sort of thing, making it much stronger effort to separate that legitimate world from those on the far right who are trying to co-opt it and use it for their own purposes. I hope that makes some sense.
Yes, and now you have the floor for some more.
Okay, you've given me the floor now. So I don't want to take up too much time talking. There's many different things that I could talk about, but there's two things that I briefly want to touch on. I want to start with Ukraine and then move out a bit broader. And by way of background, I think Viola explained at the beginning who I am. I'm a journalist who focuses on the far right, and most of my work is in Central and Eastern Europe. And I spent a lot of time in Ukraine writing about the far right, researching the far right. And I'm actually writing a book right now about the Azov movement in Ukraine, who, as Robert of course mentioned them earlier. So there's kind of a broader question that people have. It's why is Ukraine a hub, relatively, a hub for the far right, and particularly for mixed martial arts in the far right. It's a very, I'll try to explain it as briefly as I can. It's certainly not as nuanced or as complex as I would like it to be. It's almost like there has to be a book for that sort of thing. But basically what happened in Ukraine after the revolution on the Maidan and war with Russian-backed forces in Eastern Ukraine was that for a number of reasons, the far right, there was an environment created where the far right became able to act with a level of openness, a level of impunity that I would argue and still argue you don't see in any other European country. This growth happened because one reason, of course, is the Azov battalion or regiment, which obviously fought in Eastern Ukraine in 2014-15, has been able to, for 5-6 years now, kind of exploit its social capital as veterans, as defenders of the nation, to kind of insulate themselves from a lot of criticism from the Ukrainian mainstream. That's one reason. But there's also been a sort of general, more quote unquote, patriotic shift in Ukrainian society where espousing nationalist views, or at least moderately nationalist views, is not, it's something that's done a bit more across the board. So there was a bit more fertile soil for somebody like Azov or other far right groups to come along, to raise their profile, to say they're doing what they're doing in defense of the nation. They frame themselves as people who are rooting out Russian influence, quite literally, in Azov's words, rooting out the fifth column of pro-Kremlin people in Ukraine. And a lot of the consequence of that is that a lot of Ukraine's mainstream, from journalists to civil society, don't give the far right the attention that it should. It's created an environment where a lot of the Ukrainian mainstream prefers to downplay the problem of the far right, saying that I mean, I've been told by some of these people that it's an identical environment. It's just the same as in Germany or somewhere like that, which I think is absurd. And then you have some level even worse, where people are flat out denying it's a problem, saying that everything is a fiction of Kremlin propaganda, or that people like me who write about it are just feeding into Kremlin propaganda. So what I noticed, particularly over the past few years, observing and researching and writing about the far right in Ukraine, was that there really was this level of openness that I have never seen anywhere else. And I'll give a good example of that. Last year, midway through last year, I wrote an article for the New Republic, an American magazine, about mixed martial arts in Ukraine. And for that article, I went with a colleague, another correspondent in Ukraine. We went to a place called the Reconquista Club. It's now closed, which is another thing that could be discussed at another time. The Reconquista Club was kind of a sports bar / MMA venue that was the ownership, not effectively, I'll just say right now, it was owned by the Azov movement. And it billed itself as the only kind of sports bar in Ukraine that had its own mixed martial arts ring in there. And so they used to have these Friday night fights, and we show up there literally coming in off the street. It's in central Kiev, was in central Kiev near the train station, so not very hard to find. Literally walked in off the street, paid our cover, sat and watched a handful of fights until it got a little bit too much for us, because we're really there observing as journalists, not taking in a dozen MMA fights. And sat there and quite literally at some venue openly owned by the far right, sat there, had a beer and burger, and watched mostly teenage young adult men beat the snot out of each other. It was a very surreal experience, and particularly surreal that it was so open that you could literally see through windows if you walked by what was going on inside. That literally somebody like me, who at least to some people within the Azov movement, recognizable as somebody who's written critical things about them, I was still able to walk in and sit in the corner and watch this entire spectacle. Now, like I said, that particular venue is closed, but I still use that as kind of a pinnacle example of how the far right can operate with a level, not open about everything, but a level of openness that I don't think you'd see in quite a lot of other European countries. I mean, I can't imagine in Germany or a place like that, there'd be a place like this in any large German city. So that's, for me, that's the Ukraine, that's why Ukraine is sort of a hub for mixed martial arts in the far right. And of course, another reason for that is, as the name Robert mentioned in his presentation, Denis Kapustin is a Russian national, obviously, who lived in Germany for some time, but he, of course, has been, I think since last year, banned from the Schengen area, and he needs a place to be. He can't go back to Russia. So he is in Ukraine. He's been in Ukraine for a while now, I think at least since 2018. And so he's, well, essentially stuck there, maybe partly by choice, but he, as one of the main, if not the main, mixed martial arts organizer in Europe, or somebody with all these different transnational connections, somebody who can speak 3 languages fluently. He's still in Ukraine in a position, even if he can't leave, to help facilitate some of these contacts. But moving on from Ukraine, one thing I wanted to touch on was also related to Kapustin, but also the de facto leader of the Rise Above movement that I mentioned. Now, most of these MMA figures on the far right, or a lot of figures on the far right, they generally don't like to talk too much for reasons that are fairly obvious. They don't want to reveal what they're up to. But in the last week, there have been 2 quite interesting interviews given by Denis Kapustin. He gave a 2-hour interview to Greg Johnson, an American white nationalist or neo-Nazi, who I believe is also banned from Schengen now. I believe he got kicked out of Sweden or Norway last year. Somebody can correct me on that. And also the de facto leader of the Rise Above movement, Robert Rundo, gave an interview with a neo-Nazi podcast a few days ago, also one of these very long 2-hour rambles, interviews about, I mean, obviously both of them are fairly guarded in the sorts of things that they talk about, but they're quite open in other things. And I've listened to both of them probably more extensively than any human being needs to. And but I think they really quite explicitly laid out some of the reasons why we should be paying attention to MMA in the far right across borders. One thing that really came out in both of what they were talking about was the importance of image and aesthetics. It's not even necessarily, obviously this is a big part of it, but it's not even necessarily these fights that they're organizing. There's something extremely important to them about the brand that they're building, the images that they have of tough. They want to create this image of tough, masculine guys who can fight for the white race. Rundo from Rise Above movement was speaking in his interview about the need in his mind to effectively control their image, to have the only pictures of them or only photos of them out there being pictures that they want. So pictures that they've taken themselves or had taken themselves looking strong, beating the snot out of people, not pictures of them looking weak or not looking like the hyper-masculine role models that they want to be. And with image being such an important thing, it also, like obviously I just alluded to, that image, so much of that image is around masculinity, being fit and in shape and muscular and wearing the cool clothes. And in both of these interviews, it was, I mean, several times in both of these interviews, they talked about how, guys who are in the far right scene, I mean, using some, pretty direct language, being like, oh yeah, this is the kind of thing girls like. You get girls like this. I have an anecdote here or there in some of these interviews about like, oh, such and such guy he was down on himself, and then he got into the scene and came to some of our fights and then met a girl. They really, more times than I even expected, both mentioned oh yeah, you can get girls in this movement. Basically, kind of really phrasing it like that, and I think that underscores how big traditional masculinity or hypermasculinity plays into their communication. But also a huge part of it, of course, again, as Robert alluded to in his presentation, is fashion. I don't think there's any MMA promotion or event that isn't tied to some sort of, whether it's their own far-right clothing brand like White Rex. The Rundo from Rise Above movement was talking about his own clothing line that he's started up. And there's other ones like Svastone in Ukraine that's very popular on the far right, very popular on the far right. I think as Pavel can describe in more detail. And because image and aesthetics are so important within MMA and the far right, it's no wonder that they're going to use fashion as well. I mean, you look at these far right fashion brands, well, for men, they're always they're not just sloppily made shirts that you'd get pressed at the mall or something. They're well made, because I've seen them in person. They're well made shirts that are meant for guys who go to the gym, who have muscles to show off, and playing up that hypermasculinity with slogans that are both kind of playing games with slogans that may not exclusively look like they're far right, but if you know kind of the code, they're clearly meant to signal to other people kind of what kind of clique or group or side of things they're part of. So I think that's something that's really important for across international networks to keep an eye on, is not just that group X or Y is trying to organize a mixed martial arts fight here or there. Obviously, those are hugely important because I'm writing about those sorts of things as well. But how these groups communicate and try to recruit young men, obviously mostly, or if not exclusively young men, the imagery that they use, how they communicate toughness, masculinity, in their own words, like reclaiming what's been taken from them in terms of masculinity. These things also really have to be paid attention to as well, because I see them all across Europe. I see them in Western Europe, and I see them in Eastern Europe and Ukraine, and I see them in the Balkans as well. So I think that's all that I have, and those are things I think people both in Ukraine and much broader need to pay some attention to.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Michael. And having mentioned especially Ukraine and the Azov movement and dealing with Ukraine since '96, I would be interested maybe later on to hear from Pavel a little bit the connection, especially with the war in the East now. I mean, you have called it a special environment. I think that's right. But it would be interesting for me to hear, for all of us to hear a little bit more. Yes. Was this movement as strong as it is now before 2014, or due to the war and due to the armament and due to the military impact coming from the East and so on?
I think Pavel
was it even endorsed?
Yeah. To that, yeah.
But now I would like to give our Polish representative now, Przemysław Witkowski, the floor before we hand over to Pavel then, speaking a bit more from the Polish perspective and also from the perspective of culture and ethnic minorities. Maybe focus a little bit on the situation, of course, in Poland, but also how we can support the prevention angle in Poland, and what's from your perspective striking, or where the bigger problems lay.
Okay, I'm very happy that on the European level we are approaching this problem with seriousness, as for many years in Poland we've been struggling with different kinds of groups of far right. And as it was mainly the European Union periphery, as also the same was for Hungary. It wasn't, I think, considered the main, threat, and the main threat were considered on the level of course, of terrorism and violence, like Islamists or Islamic terrorists. But as I see lately, and sadly, we have been for many years a bit of, how to say, very modern in being reactionary, in the sense that Poland has been a training ground for a long time. Now its training ground has been moved, in my opinion, and I agree with my colleagues, to Ukraine, as the situation in Ukraine is much more, I would say, problematic, considering the war in eastern part and instability politically, and all the events that happened the last 10 years. So technically, it's much easier for far righters to meet, to communicate, to organize concerts or fights or any kind of activity which is open for public in Ukraine than in Poland. But for many years, Poland or Hungary has been places of high activity of these people. So one, okay, let's say the training ground has moved, but on the other hand, Poland and Hungary still plays the role of the gate through which through festivals and like events like 11th of November, which is the Polish national holiday, and a great march that is held in Warsaw. So that can have like more than 150,000 people. And this march is an occasion to gather for the far right, also outside of Poland. I would say they have guests from all over Europe. So and as this move, but still we are becoming an important element of the whole Europe network of far right and extremist right connecting with each other and communicating. As I mentioned, this 11th of November was one of the events which were alluding them to Poland, but also through the 90s and zeros from a lot of concerts, far-right concert, racist, fascist, and Nazis being held in Poland in different places. Now I see a big change because as we are becoming more and more stable part of, let's say, I hope, of European Union, this is more cooperation and more, civilization of these activities. So they are more and more pushed outside. They're not so easy accessible as they were earlier. But still, as talking about MMA and far right, the problem in Poland is that the whole environment is shifted very much to the right. Technically, if you compare the Polish political scene with, let's say, German or English or I don't know, for sure, I know Scandinavia, I wouldn't say about Scandinavia, but let's say compare with, let's say, kind of average of Europe, Poland is much to the right, also Hungary. And as I see the acceptance for different kind of expressions are not only bigger, but also a lot of them are being, used by our government or Hungarian government as a part of international politics, like homophobia, for example. Like you may say that you can find homophobic remarks in different, sports zones, but here we are not talking about like clubs or individuals. We're talking about politics who speak like anti-ideology of LGBT or gender ideology or whatever. So technically, it's not only one thing. Also, the anti-left-wing perspective is very, very obvious, like in Polish government, and no matter which it was, because earlier when the conservative liberals ruled, it also was anti-left, like communist times, the period of occupation and the devastation of Polish nation, blah blah blah. So technically, if you look on the Polish MMA fighters, they do not really feel any pressure or any kind of body that would really force them or like convince them even to change what they are saying. So if you look on the Polish political scene, you can divide that into three parts. One would be like a mainstream right-wing populists, this Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, Law and Justice Party. Then you got Konfederacja, which is quite similar to Alternative für Deutschland in Germany. And you have these all extremist, groups, autonomic nationalists, terrorists, neo-pagans, Nazis, and so on and so on. And they all of them have this kind of representation in the combat sports circle. Like this right-wing populists in Prawo i Sprawiedliwość, they even had a former fighter, Tomasz Adamek, a candidate on the list, and this guy is deeply homophobic, accepting violence towards women in jokes or something like that. very religious, ultra conservative, controlling all his children. So technically, he was like a role model, not like okay, he didn't in the end got the position in Parliament or European Parliament as he was candidating there, but still he was like on the list. So technically, it was kind of at least accepted. You got, of course, the whole palette of freak fighters in MMA, because as MMA is legal in Poland completely, and you got fights which are like including kind of muscle celebrities, the guys which are not really great fighters, but they are known for being known, and then they are fighting, and this gives attention and on streaming and blah blah blah. So technically, you got these kind of guys, and in this kind of guys, which are not like extremists like here, but they are ideas about reality, about women, about gay, trans people, are like aggressive, violent, or at least deeply critical, not in the civilized way, in a vulgar way. So this is one group. Then, as we move to the like these circles which we'll mention today more, you've got, of course, tournaments like it was mentioned, First to Fight, which had at least three like open like tournaments, one in Warsaw, one in Poznań, and one in Radom, which were like also again a place of presentation of groups which in some countries are illegal, like autonomic nationalists. And of course, there were guests from France, from White Red from Russia, from Italy, and from Hungary. So technically, all of these events were also the part of this kind of a network, which was mentioned by Robert in the beginning, and all the names of the tournaments are at least coordinating their activities in the sense that they are exchanging information, contacts, or people from one group which organizes one event goes to the other. So technically, they are much better organized than we are right now. Of course, we have like all institutions of the state and the European Union, but we are not really, or at least we have not been for many years, focused on this kind of situation. And here they remind me of amoeba, this kind of primitive organism which doesn't have a shape, because when they move and they're trying to find a gap in which they can enter with the ideology, they are like amoeba, like, no real shape, by entering every place they can. And here the sports or popular music, or like general music, are the circles which they find the most, like, I would say, easy to enter, in that sense that it doesn't you don't have to be very prepared to watch this kind of events. It's very inviting in that sense, but it's also popular. Also, I would say that like there is something in sport which is not problematic, because like sport is sport, but technically this is not like they don't play cricket or they don't play polo, but they take this, because in the far right ideology you have this kind of domination, violence, hierarchy elements which are similar to like fights. Of course, it doesn't make like any combat sport something bad, but in that sense they choose not randomly, they choose something which is connected with the image of the world, competition, this kind of Darwinian perspective, especially in kind of Nazi circles. I think it's something which helps them to be part of this and choose these sports exactly. Again, I also have to say that like there are brands which are already mentioned, but there are more of them, of course, like Russian Beloyar, I mentioned Swaston from Ukraine. In Poland, we have a Keep It White. Ansgar Aryan is Latin German. Thor Steiner, I think, is German. So technically, you got sponsors. I have in my chapter, I also prepared the list of clubs which are infiltrated by far right, as I know from my informers. And I prepared, of course, list of the brands which are also promoted during these events or sponsor this kind of events. So technically, I have that in your book, in our book. The main problem here, like summing up this, is like this acceptance and this shift of Polish political scene to the right. Because technically, as I mentioned, no real body is putting any kind of pressure, as we have in football, for example, UEFA. which is giving, fines or trying to promote some kind of positive behavior or control the behavior which is unacceptable. Here in Poland, there is nothing like that. I've sent like dozens of emails to the organization, the main organization of MMA fights, asking, do they have any part in any kind of network preventing this kind of racist, homophobic, sexist, or whatever kind of xenophobic remarks by the fighters? Do they promote any kind of positive behavior? Do they have any kind of programs which can change the situation inside this discipline? And no matter who I wrote, I got no answer. I don't see any kind of activities like that. So technically, they just don't care about that. If I wrote a big piece in newspaper about that, and it was mentioned that in my email that I'm writing this kind of for both Polish and European level, and I was mentioning that I'm gonna put the answers or lack of answers in this, and I sent like 16 mails to different people. So I say it's like really we don't really care about that. And this is, and again, the people who view these kind of events very often does not put their own any kind of pressure on them, so they don't feel anyone who is like over them and saying you're doing something wrong or something is problematic with what the fighter said. So on that level, I think some countries of Central Western Europe, I would say, are more like sensitive to this problem, and we are reacting as the societies are also reacting, maybe because of bigger diversity of ethnic diversity than Poland. With Poland is technically like 95% Polish ethnicity. So maybe the activity of different groups which are fighting for their own, perspective on the reality of rights, they can have a positive impact also in other, spheres. But in my opinion, okay, we cannot change the political shifts in Poland, okay? But we may try to find a way to put the pressure, like UEFA is putting the pressure on football clubs. Maybe fines, maybe promotion, maybe anti-racist, maybe different kinds of activities which would help to push the fighters which are connected to extreme right from the official bigger clubs, and they would. Okay, sorry, I have to end. Okay, thank you.
No, you don't have to end, but since I would like to listen to Pavel, and we have a couple of questions, and my colleague Tomasz Frankowski will have the opportunity to say later on some few conclusions and remarks, I would like to have a couple of minutes in between. So Pavel, we have heard a lot about Ukraine already, and now you are the latest one in the row to give us some more detail on the development of Azov, which is indeed striking, but also, as some of the colleagues have said before, that Ukraine becomes a hub for right-wing extremists, fighters, MMA, and so on and so forth. And of course, you are willing and free to speak about many more topics, since you are the representative of the FAR project with and FIFA, and maybe explain a little bit about this and then the particular cases in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Viola. Indeed, before diving into Ukraine rabbit hole, let's say, it has been mentioned so many times on this webinar today. I'll start rather with a different angle with football. That's something I work with for the past 7-8 years, and that's something that I think has played a very important role in the development and of the far-right infrastructure in combat sports and its popularity. So I work for the FAIR Network, which is a global network of organizations that is tackling discrimination in football and using football as a tool for social inclusion. So we have quite a lot of experience with things that we have talked about on how to use sports to promote diversity and to promote inclusion and tackle the far-right extremism in sports. Although there's quite a difference between MMA as a participant sport and football hooliganism, where it's not the footballers who are causing the violence, and it's not the footballers who are participating in far-right groups most of the time, but it's the fans. So the difference is quite fundamental. I think I won't be far from truth when I say we have first detected the overlap between football hooligans and the emerging back then MMA scene, and someone who has been already mentioned on this call, Denis Kapustin, or Nikitin as he's publicly known. Back in 2013, we have published a guide to discriminatory signs and symbols in European football as part of our monitoring system, recording incidents of discrimination in football, where white tracks as a clothing brand and as something that Nikitin sells has been included and detailed in that guide back in 2013. I would like to point that I saw a question from FIFA on the chat, and would like to point that we have been working with UEFA and FIFA with our monitoring system, tracking the development and the infiltration of the far-right groups into football fan scene across Europe and beyond. So this is something we can pick up on, and I've seen in the question there was a mention of the new treaty or the new agreement signed between FIFA and UNODC. But coming back to the MMA and combat sports and the far right, I would like to point that the far right have not created the fashion for combat sports. They have not created something new. They have rather responded to a rise in popularity of the whole fitness industry and of increased professionalization of violence among football hooligans and among far-right activists, and provided a space to develop this, but also at the same time finding a golden middle ground, catering to their activists who have become increasingly more interested in organized training and in professional violence, but also tapping into recruiting new people through due to the popularity of the mainstream MMA fighting. The UFC in the US has been televised worldwide, etc., etc. So finding the middle ground, catering to their own activists, to their own people already, and recruiting new people. And I think it is important to point out that what are the specific dangers of the far right infiltrating or creating networks with combat sports and with fight clubs. It's not the fact that they're selling the image. Yes, it might help them to attract more people, selling a more attractive image of a far right activist or their ideology that they are promoting. But it's the purpose of their training. They're not just trained to be stronger. They train to apply it in the streets. And we need to understand that these are ethnic minorities who will be attacked. We need to understand that these are LGBTIQ people who are demonstrating on the streets that will be attacked. And we see this more and more from the US and Charlottesville to places in Poland and elsewhere. Where far-right activists more and more are exercising violence and promoting it against minorities on the streets, using the training that they have acquired, and they're quite explicit in that. And I think the MMA, the combat sports, has helped to respond and modernize the far-right ideology. It's no coincidence that the Rise Above movement in the US is branded as the prime fight club of the alt-right. It has responded to new challenges and new vision of the far-right ideology pretty much worldwide, talking about migration, talking about identity, talking about reclaiming the space, etc., etc. So MMA here is instrumental. And let's not forget that there is nothing fundamentally racist in the sport itself. As with football, it's being misused by the far right, used as an instrument. So the far right are parasiting on certain qualities or certain characteristics, the same way they do this in football. So they talk about discipline, masculinity, toxic masculinity is central to their ideology. So they're picking and mixing quite an interesting image to sell to their fighters and to recruit new people. Coming back to let's say the crossover between football and MMA and the far right groups, I think it's useful to recognize, you know, how much crossover there is and how many activists are you know, both active in the football hooligan scene and in the mixed martial arts. And I don't want to mention Nikitin or Kapustin too much on this call. I think he's been mentioned a dozen times already, but it's since he has been one of the pioneers. And talking about the nature of sport, I would like to point to the origins of his White Rex clothing brand and MMA tournaments. In one of the interviews, he has explicitly said that creating MMA tournaments, so he was firstly selling neo-Nazi clothing. That was his thing. You know, he was a football hooligan selling neo-Nazi clothing, you know, bringing some Thorsteiner clothing from Germany and selling it to neo-Nazis in Russia. But then he saw the rise in popularity of mixed martial arts, of training, various sports. Football hooligans have been training jiu-jitsu, Muay Thai for quite a while individually. But something that he has pointed out was that the MMA scene or generally martial arts scene in Russia at that time in 2008, and it still is quite diverse. In fact, it is mostly dominated, and pretty much from the Soviet times. You take judo, you take various other martial arts, have been pretty much dominated and very popular among Russia's ethnic minority populations, mostly from the North Caucasus, Azerbaijanis, Armenians as well. So North Caucasus, Chechnya, Dagestan, etc., etc. And Nikitin or Kapustin has explicitly said that he wants to, whenever you go to a gym, you see people from North Caucasus. And he explicitly said that he wants to create a white fight clubs to cater to white fighters who would not need to, you know, to lose fights to North Caucasian fighters. So this has been a very explicit message from the very beginning. So you see that sport is, you know, integrally it's not racist in itself, and we need to understand that. And it's also a lesson for, you know, preventative work across Europe. I mean, martial arts are quite diverse as well. They're popular across various ethnicities and ethnic minority communities in Europe as well. And this is something that might help to tackle the issue in general. But coming back to, I won't take much longer, and really grateful to everyone who's still with us after 1.5 hours, going strong. So tapping into the Ukraine topic, Ukraine indeed has a unique position since 2013 not just on the European map, but globally as a hub, as a place for pilgrimage. It's not just because, you know, Denis Kapustin is staying there and operating from there, but it's because of the political impunity that far-right groups are enjoying in Ukraine. Michael has written extensively about that and has pointed a few things on this call already, but I would like to point specifically at the role of the Minister of the Interior, who's been in the Ukrainian government since 2013, Arsen Avakov, who has been the patron saint of the Azov regiment, the creator, the financier, and who provides basically the legal cover for the Azov regiment and for most of the activities they're doing. And it's not just, you know, a straight clientelistic relationship. He's not financing them, but he has allowed them to grow into a network that is spanning various areas of social life in Ukraine. They organize children camps. They organize gyms and martial arts sections in small cities across all of Ukraine. But most importantly, they tapped into business patronage systems, providing security, providing cover for shady deals in the business sector, acquiring enormous sums of money. Someone who's labeled as a financier of the Azov regiment or their treasurer, someone who goes by the nickname Botsman, Sergei Korotkych, who's a Belarusian neo-Nazi who's been linked to mixed martial arts as well in his own time. He has acquired millions of dollars and has a direct relationship with Denis Nikitin and helping him to organize things. So we're talking here about the impunity and lack of any sort of obstacles, either from the side of civil society in Ukraine or from the side of governments, to prevent the music concerts that we've mentioned, with bands from neo-Nazi bands from all over Europe coming to Ukraine without any obstacles, nor the mixed martial arts scene that is flourishing. Ukraine has never been a hub for, known for sports or for MMA scene, in fact, until 2013. The first big far-right tournament has been organized by Kapustin in 2013 only. And before that, Ukraine has not had, much sporting success. So it's not the sporting merit or popularity of MMA in the country that has attracted the far rights to the country. It's precisely the political impunity and the blind eye that the government is turning on the activities of the far right and their legitimacy in society. I think that's few of the most important points I wanted to make, and I'm happy to follow up with the discussion.
Thank you, Pavel. That was very important. And also, I think you made an important point. While somebody from the Combat Sports Authority was not really complaining, but explaining, and then you made the point that MMA is not not racist in itself. But of course, in the circumstances, all of your colleagues have explained, the environment is that there is a linkage between some of the actors in that respect. I got one of the questions once again, and I read it out loud. Maybe one of you might pick it up. Sharing this campaign, Love Fighting, Have Violence. It is important to understand the difference between educative approaches and the rest. But where is the borderline? Who would like to? Is it Julia? Is it your turn, or somebody else would like to?
Yeah, I can definitely give a try. But the problem, of course, is I wish there were clear lines. Whenever it comes to radicalization, it's always somewhat blurry. I mean, there's some very clear indicators if within the sport clubs things happen that contradict our basic free democratic values and principles. That's very clearly not productive in the sense of prevention. But I think it starts a lot earlier. If you want to use combat sport as an educative tool, everybody needs to feel welcome. So as soon as people do not feel welcome there, or feel like they cannot express their thoughts or also their feelings, where they don't feel like they can be themselves and share vulnerabilities and worries and emotions, etc. I think this is already where it starts to be counterproductive to prevention. But as I said, there's obviously no clear borderline, if you would like to call it that. I wish there was, but you need to be very careful, of course, when you select, for example, sport clubs to include in prevention programs. You need to really carefully see what kind of people there are, what approaches they use, to make sure that they don't work against your prevention efforts. Yeah, but I wish there was an easy answer to this.
Viola, maybe I can answer for a very...
Yes, you can. And then maybe somebody should also refer to the question, how about the UEFA Euro 2024? Is that a vehicle to address the problem? maybe one of you could come back to this question before I finally hand over to my colleague, Tomasz Frankowski. Yes, Robert, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I share everything Julia just said. Thank you for this. I mean, the basic rule normally is that it's sports when both people join a competition. So if two neo-Nazis hit each other in an athletic surrounding, an athletic setting, it's sports. It's violence if one of them doesn't want this. The problem there is we have interviewed lots of gyms, and mostly in most of the cases, the even fascists, violent fascists have not done much wrong in their gyms because they know it's an athletic setting there. The problem rather is that they are professionalizing their violence, their combat techniques, their fighting techniques, to use them outside of the gym. So the problems are mostly not inside of the gyms, but on the streets. And the big network I talked about in Germany, of course, they are responsible for a very, very, very long list of racist and political attacks. That's where they use what they learned in the gyms. Thank you.
And that was what also I think Pavel or Michael has mentioned, the purpose of the training, the purpose of the fight. So Pavel, would you like to reply to the question of? Okay. Mm-hmm.
Sure. On the Euro 2024, it's a very interesting question, and I think UEFA, as the governing body of European football, has a responsibility to tackle discrimination in football and among football fans, part of whom are certainly engaging in far right groups and in violent behavior, and are part of our clientele in the MMA scene, especially in Germany. But I don't think it's up for the UEFA to tap into the MMA scene. They're governing football. There is certainly a problem, among the fans, and I would like to see fan groups and fan organizations step up, to take some responsibility and tackle, the far right fan groups as well. But it's generally sporting mega events have the potential to highlight certain issues. Euro 2024 takes place in Germany, so given the problems that we talked about here on this webinar and the popularity of the far right MMA fight clubs in Germany, it's an interesting peg to talk about this in sports in general. And I'm pretty sure UEFA would be glad to step in. Something else on big institutions having an influence. I'm very grateful for Viola von Kramon for organizing this webinar today, this conference today, and generally this topic being raised at high levels by the members of the European Parliament. And there is certainly things that need to be done by the EU institutions to tackle and to stop the spread of the far right groups in the combat sports, not just inside the EU, but as we've talked about Ukraine. I think there is a lot of potential for influence on the Ukrainian government through the available EU institutions, the European Neighborhood Partnership, but also Council of Europe. So I would like to call on the European Parliament, the Council, and other EU institutions to raise these issues with the Ukrainian government and the Minister of the Interior specifically, because it's not just an internal problem of the Ukrainians and Ukrainian government. As we've noticed today, far-right activists from all over Europe, inside the European Union, from the US, are traveling to Ukraine, not just to network, but to get training. And we're not just talking about MMA, but also firearms, etc., etc. So I would like to the problem to be elevated at the European level, and of course, with all the complexity dealing with the situation in Ukraine and Russia, especially. But still, these issues have to be addressed.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. So before we close, this is now Tomasz' time to come. As a former professional soccer or football player, I think he might see some things different or not. I will look forward to this. Thanks already for all the panelists and thanks for all the audience staying with us. I will hand over now to Tomasz, who is a very valuable colleague from EPP. As I said, a former professional soccer player. There are not so many around. And so I think his insights and his closing remarks will be of big interest. Tomasz, you have the floor. Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody. So I would like to thank all the speakers for the presentation and a very interesting discussion. It shows that the growing capture of sports by right-wing extremists is for sure a worrying trend. It comes mainly from some communities that are particularly led by extremists and some illegal branches of combat sport involved in the criminal activities. As we could hear today, this is a very complex subject and there is no one solution to tackle this problem. I would say that here are a set of recommendations, exchanges of good practices, maybe the introduction of regulations. That is why it is very important to support the governments in the member states to establish the policy to stop extreme right and racism, not only in combat sport, but in sport in general. As we can observe, this issue concerns less martial sports and combat sports, which are organized in the structures and governed by the European federations. On the other hand, we cannot forget that mixed martial arts are still important sport for society, which teaching and promoting some values like as respect, and we should continue. So what is next? We need to continue this discussion with the stakeholders, the European Parliament, European Commission, and especially with the member states, I think. We need to closely cooperate with the Council of Europe, which as we see work already on this problem. It has some good recommendations. I hope that we will be able to tackle this problem and to stop this trend at European level. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot to everyone. Thanks a lot, Tomasz. Thanks for everyone who contributed. It was, I would say, a start for a problem, which, as you said, Tomasz, there's not one solution. It will take some time. We will find out on the European level, on the member states level, and also outside of the European Union, how to support NGOs, how to support groups, how to implement prevention measures which are effective and so on. But for now and for today, thanks a lot. These were two very, very interesting hours. And hopefully we can continue maybe in half a year or whenever it is appropriate. And whenever you have interesting events, don't hesitate, please, to share them with us. Thanks so much and see you soon. Maybe in Brussels in live, or in Kiev, or in Belgrade, or in Warsaw, wherever. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.